your group is very active in the business, and so too is PMI, for whom I do a lot of work in these avenues. So this is a great topic for me because it's really been the basis for my entire career. I started working in project management in about 1966 and have kind of parlayed that background and experience into a career that spanned pretty much the globe. And mostly now over the last 20 years, I mostly just talk about the things that work well and the things that don't work well. So I always look forward to the opportunity to share my knowledge with people in this environment. Over the last 3 months, I've visited about 17 countries talking about project management and to a lesser extent, PMOs. It turns as though the PMO has become a critical part of the success of project management. They have a hand in glove relationship. I just came from the World's PMO Awards ceremony in Saudi Arabia, where the PMO of the year and the PMO director and those kinds of people were named in terms of global response from judges throughout the world. So I've got a chance to see that close up and see how that all works. So I want to try to tie all this together. I think, first of all, I want to make sure that you understand that when we talk about governance, and we'll talk about that more later on, in a way, the project management body of knowledge is the first real demonstrated attempt to have some governance over the process of project management. I think it's very important to understand that project management uncontrolled is less than value add in many cases. In fact, it actually can cause difficulty and challenge. I got my first taste of how important project management was in my first position working for a company called Chicago Bridge and Iron, which basically developed and constructed double-walled cryogenic storage tanks. Well, at that time, project management, this in the 60s, at that time, project management was basically making sure that all the things fit together at the right time. So it looked more like a flow diagram than anything. But it does quickly point out that without it, you can't assemble a double-walled storage tank without some kind of a map or a sequence or a project plan, if you choose to use that terminology, that helps you fit it together in the appropriate way. So that was my first exposure. And from that, I learned the criticality of project management, the fact that not only do we have to understand how things fit together, we have to understand how they got completed in the first place, what parts were drawn, what parts were built, and how those things all fit together. So we have to understand how that process works very well. And project management has grown since then. And I facetiously look at this slide to point out that uncontrolled project management is as bad as no control. So in the early days of PMI, they're just now celebrating their 53rd year in existence, and they have over 600,000 members in the organization. But what happened was in about 1996 was the first time that PMBOK, the official guide for project management, was published. And in between the 60s when I learned and the 96 when the first formal publication was made, a lot of experimentation took place, a lot of recognizing what works and what doesn't work before it was put down in a document that gave people guidance in how to execute project management. So in 1996, when they issued the first formal governance document, if you will, people began to realize this is not a hobby. This is a real live career path that has a tremendous impact on an organization's ability to be profitable and to maintain continuity in their product offerings to customers. So the Project Management Institute picked up on that and understood it very nicely and helped people to get in line with the idea of managing projects in that way would add value to the organization. And what I saw happen over the years is that more and more people began to realize that structure and process were vital to the success of organizations. And so we began to see more and more organizations embrace the concepts of project management. And as they started to do that, they started to realize that there was a need for, I'm going to call it just change control, generally speaking, but this is where governance comes in. We can't just have change uncontrolled, unbridled change. There has to be a governance portion to this process that enables us to restrict arbitrary change and only allow those changes that meet the needs of the organization. Now, from the time of 66 to 96, I spent most of that time working in R&D, research and development, primarily with national laboratories. Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, that's the P&L, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, Chicago AMR Proprietary Information Laboratory. And those places were very reluctant to embrace project management because they felt that it would constrain their freedom to innovate and create. And so I spent my time basically trying to convince the users of project management in the R&D environment that not only would it not stifle creativity, but it would in fact enable them to more efficiently use the time that they had available to spark innovation. And as that started to catch on in the 1980s, we began to realize that we needed some additional way of confirming that an individual or a group of individuals have embraced the ideas of project management, and therefore PMI created, luckily I had a chance to be involved with that, created the Project Management Professional Certification process. That got off to a slow start after about 10 years of advertising, so to speak. The PMP, we had only about 6,000 PMPs in the world, and that's not what you'd call a significant number. There's estimated now to be a need for 20 to 24 additional million project managers in our career field. So we've got to look at this in terms of how it all fits together and how it makes sense for the environment that we're in today. So in about roughly 1994, 1995, when project management was becoming on its own and starting to make an impact, we saw the organizations, the IBMs, the AT&Ts, the Motorola's, the Sprints, the major corporations of America embrace the PMBOK and therefore embrace the PMP as a way to certify their internal project management expertise was in line with the environment's guidance, which was coming in the form of the PMBOK. So that's when we started to see the number of people who were seeking this PMP designation went up exponentially. Now, so that you can get a flavor of that, let me tell you, at this point in time, and I noticed in the intro that your organization has about 50,000 certified. That's fantastic. We have in the PMP world, it was just announced this last week that we now have 1.5 million PMPs in the world today. Now, this is literally the worldwide. We have 300 chapters of the PMI organization scattered throughout the world, and each of them embrace the PMBOK idea and embrace the PMP. So we're beginning to see the concept of project management come into its own. And I think without the idea of governance, without the idea of having some process by which we control how these things take place, how they get implemented, how they get utilized, you end up with chaos. So I think we've done a favor for the environment by putting some governance over this idea of PMPs, which then ripples, of course, into the idea of project management and PMOs. Now, I will tell you, in 1977, I was moved from General Electric Company to the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory in the state of Washington in the United States. And to my credit, without knowing it, I formed an organization called Management Information and Support, at which time Paul Dinsmore, who unfortunately has passed on now, wrote many books about PMOs and credited me with beginning the first PMO, the first formal PMO in the business. Now, again, I didn't call it a PMO. I didn't know what a PMO was, but I call it Management Information and Support. And it turns out that was the beginning of the PMO concepts. So if you look at that, what happened is it morphed over time. I always felt like a PMO was a support group that provide, because I was working with R&D people who didn't really know much about project management. So my quote PMO was basically a support organization who went out and worked with the R&D people to help them implement and utilize project management in conducting their R&D work. Clearly, since then, it has expanded substantially. And now we see the PMOs are a much more sophisticated organization. Some of them still have a high degree of support function. Others of them are control function. And by that, I mean, they actually maintain the governance over the use of project management on the various projects being done with the organization. And they're responsible to make sure that the governance issues are not violated and that things are being done according to the documentation that we have in place. So it's more quite a bit. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, obviously, as we go. But let's go ahead and change slides and continue our discussion at this point. Thank you. Now, this is the point that I want to make for all of you who are already involved with PMOs, and there's thousands of people who make their living running, organizing, implementing, revising, re-implementing PMOs within the organization. I just want to make sure that I'm clear that having a PMO does not necessarily mean your projects are going to be successful. I think sometimes we misunderstand what the power of a PMO is. And so in this case, I want to make sure you realize that no matter what environment you're in, and I truly believe that PMOs and project management, for that matter, are applicable in any environment you choose. Everything is a project, and therefore everyone is a project manager. If you look at what you do on a day-to-day basis, I think you'll come to that same conclusion, whether it's the personal things you do in your life or whether it's the work that you do for your organization. If you look at the combination of the things that go on in executing those kinds of efforts, you are operating a project. Whether you call it that, it doesn't matter to me what you call it. But the fact of the matter is, a project is a project is a project. So because I worked in R&D so much of my career, I found that this particular slide had extreme relevance to the world that I dealt in. I spent a lot of time in my early years understanding terminology, understanding the kinds of definitions that the R&D people use to describe the work they do compared to what perhaps a construction manager might run into. So it's important to realize that in order to be effective in the implementation of project management and the utilization of a PMO to control that process, you have to be clear in that you understand the environment in which you are working. Some people say, well, it doesn't really matter. A project is a project. Well, that's true. But the efficiency within which you can operate is highly dependent upon you being able to speak their language. We see this in the PMP exam. If any of you have taken it recently, I get feedback from people who've taken the recent exam that it's the hardest test they've ever taken. It's the most difficult exam they've ever sat for. These are people with master's degrees. Some people with PhD degrees are now saying that the PMP exam is the most difficult exam they've ever sat for. Well, I don't doubt that. I'm sure it's a very difficult exam. Now, we don't, as one of the founders, I don't get to see the exam. That's guarded with extreme care to keep that private and proprietary. But knowing that we've made that exam challenging on purpose, we don't want people to be called PMPs when they're not. I mean, if they're just test takers, that's one thing, but we want people who can execute projects, who can create high performance teams, who can motivate and stimulate individuals required to work on their projects. We have to understand that we're now dealing almost primarily in matrix or organizations. So a project manager who may have the authority designated, unfortunately, he or she does not have ownership of the resources that it takes to execute that project. So here again, governance becomes an issue. I need some governance over who assigns what resources to what projects so that we can begin to see there's some consistency in that we are using the right personnel with the right skill sets to deliver the projects. We're not producing support that's beyond the need of the organization. In other words, overqualified. We're not providing support that's, quote, underqualified. Our job is to make sure that we do a skill set match so that as we define the work content, that we match up the appropriate personnel. This is a business function, but it's controlled by governance. We have to know who's supplying those people and what basis are they using to do that. So as we look at the way we plan a project, understanding the terminology, understanding the methodology by which people are assigned will be critical to the success that a project manager might expect to achieve. We have had many examples of projects that were failed, not because we couldn't do the work, not because we didn't understand the work, but because we were not assigned the appropriate skill set match to execute the work. So one of the things project managers have to do, as you look at the process of project management, everything starts, as you know, with the charter. And once it's defined in terms of what the work really looks like, then we can begin to think about what the skill set match possibilities are. And if we do it effectively, we'll be able to identify the delta in terms of what the difference will be from actual desired performance to actual performance based on skill set mismatch. That has to be incorporated into the plan. We have to understand that if we say it's going to take 8 hours, if a skill set number one does the work based on their subject matter expertise, and then we're assigned skill set number two, which is inferior from a skill set capability. We know by definition the time for that work will go out. It'll take longer. Not because the work scope changed, but because the person who's delivering the work is not the person that we originally hoped we would have assigned to us. These are all issues associated with project management that have a governance element to them. Now, when we look at project management, one of the things that we attempt to do is look at what governance do we need to have. Thanks for hanging in there. I appreciate it very much. I really want to emphasize to you the importance of this. Now, I'm an engineering background, so I probably adapted to the technical terminology more quickly than some, but the more you can talk the language, the more cooperation you'll get from the individuals, and the more definitive the plan will be relative to the process. I think it's important to recognize that even though governance does not address specifically the subject matter expert mismatch problem that we face, it does face up to the idea of changing personnel and how that impacts the project. So we do have to have some governance over the flexibility that an individual has to have. And when you're dealing in a matrix, you see, the problem is the people who own these resources, the people who loan them out to project managers, find that they have other priorities. And in fact, oftentimes will do what I call bait and switch, which gives you a very strong personnel to do the job. But then as you get into it, the resource pool owner sees a better application of that individual and assigns someone else to take the place. Well, we need to be able to quantify the impact of that quote bait and switch so that we can identify whether we can accept that or not. If that bait and switch has a negative impact on the project, then the governance has to step in and limit the amount of that arbitrary change that can take place. Now, in some of the PMOs, and some of you may be operational in that environment, some of the PMOs actually house the skill set capabilities for project management, not the technical implementers, not the technical contributors, but the actual project manager works for and reports to the PMO. So that's one of the more sophisticated approaches to using the PMO. And some have gone even beyond that, where they capture some of the individual contributors as part of the PMO as well. I don't have a specific preference one way or the other, but I think it has to be arbitrated. It has to be articulated and communicated to all those people that are involved. Now, this is not the same. It's not redundant with the overall governance of the organization. This is the organizational's governance over the PMO and how that PMO interacts with the projects that are being done. So once you've got that down to where you understand what the terminology is, now you're going to be able to have what I call an intelligent conversation. And when we begin to look at what the project plan looks like, we know that it represents reality in how we go about getting the work done. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's what we get into. And one of the reasons that a PMO is so important. We group, the PMOs are typically defined as a organizational capability to increase the potential of projects being completed effectively. Okay, so that's a mouthful. But what we've got to understand is that we have the other side of the organization, which is not the quote project side, which is more of the business side, focusing on profitability, focusing on marketability, and some of the business aspects of running an organization. And so when the planning is done for what businesses will do to promote the next year's revenue stream, it is often the case that the specifics of any given potential project are not really thoroughly discussed. And so when they go away, when the senior level people go away to plan next year's work, they typically go to some place where there's sun and surf and easy to relax and think straight. And so they spend a lot of time going through what could be done more effectively, what could be done more efficiently than has been done in the past. And so you begin to see that that process looks very similar to what we've been saying all along, is that we need to put in a process that allows people to understand what the expectations are. So if you look at this idea of the business units going away for a quote, private session, if you will, then you have to understand that they're going to be making decisions without the information that's needed at the project level. So when they come back to the organization and identify the work that they want done from their business sector perspective, it's almost a sure thing that the project is going to be starting behind schedule and probably over cost, because they've planned it based on determining what the profitability is. So they planned the project based on how much cost they wanted to incur, based on how much revenue they anticipated to generate, and giving them a percent profitability. Well, that's excellent thinking from the business perspective, but from a project management perspective, there has to be some governance that says we're not going to accept arbitrary numbers from the business side until we have a chance to look at them from the project implementation perspective. We want to be able to know what can we do to deliver what the organization is expecting us to deliver. And that's where we get into this idea of preliminary planning. If you look at your organizational process, we skip this step in most organizations. We don't have a preliminary planning process that confirms the validity of the numbers that are brought to the project management, to the PMO, if that's where they flow through and then are distributed to the project managers. But that preliminary number is never validated. It's accepted as though something magical was going to happen to make it possible to do what the business side of the house wants to do. You have to understand these are two very dramatically different components. The business people are looking at how can I derive the most profitability. The project management side of the business is determining what can I actually deliver to enable the business people to be effective. So it's a huge difference. And what I'm pointing out here is the need for dialogue to take place between the business side and the execution side, the project management side. And that's one of the reasons the PMO has become so critical, is that the PMO has a quote, governance role that is going to confirm before they pass it along to some quote innocent project manager thinking that the numbers they have are what they need to do the job. The PMO is going to confirm by looking at it from a preliminary perspective, by looking at it from a governance perspective, that they are going to be able to pass along to the individual contributors data or information that does not set them up for failure. So project priority in the eyes of the business is they're all number one. That's, you've all experienced this. If you happen to have a project that actually is number one, then what you know is that you have tremendous amount of leverage in getting the support that you need for your project. The PMO has a tremendous amount of leverage to impact how things get executed. However, the business side is very reluctant to identify priorities because they all think each of their projects are number one priority. And their view is get her done. That's all they care about. Well, if you've got 10 projects and they're all priority one, then you obviously have a problem. When it comes to skill set assignments, when it comes to time, duration, implementation, this is going to be impacted by the true project priority. So the PMO has a responsibility to say, wait a minute, we've got to take a look at this because we don't want to set our project people up to where they can't be effective in delivering what the business side of the house is expecting. So that's the side of the project management that we don't do very well. How many of you, just ask yourself, how many of you accept a project charter without ever doing any work to confirm that the duration, that the expenditures, that some of the high-level technical deliverables are consistent with what the project is going to be able to accomplish? If you don't, you're headed for trouble. If you don't, your project, you won't find out for sure until you're about halfway done, and you're going to realize, oh my goodness, I'm in deep trouble here. I should have checked these numbers well before I started. So the PMO can provide that sort of check and balance, if you will, to prevent project people from running amok with the work that they've accepted through the project management process. Next slide, please. I think it's important, while we're changing the slide, I think it's important to remember that the project management people, the people who actually deliver the goods, so to speak, for an organization to be successful, are oftentimes the least informed, and oftentimes leading them to make mistakes, make judgments, make decisions that are inconsistent with reality. And so what we get with that is the idea that if you look at this slide, this is a powerful, powerful slide. Because project managers create decision support information, that's one of their primary deliverables, is to deliver that kind of information to the business side to incorporate into their decision making, is to provide them with that kind of information. And most organizations will hold, generally it's a monthly meeting, depending on the criticality of the project. It could be twice a month, but they hold a meeting where the project manager prepares a report that identifies the status of the particular project that he or she is responsible for. And they don't look forward to these sessions because they can be rather grueling. If you look at what I'm saying is that if you're midway in and you're starting to see the reality of how deep a hole you're in based on the determination of the reality versus speculation, you don't look forward to go in front of the senior level management people and having them begin to ask you very penetrating questions, because they don't want to hear the truth. And that's, I mean, I can say that in a nice way, but the fact of the matter is the senior level decision makers really only want to hear the truth when it's consistent with their perception of reality. If it doesn't match their perception of reality, you see, that's a problem, because now they may have to report it up to their management, and they don't want to do that. So we enter into these meetings, we project people enter into these meetings, and sometimes in the interest of the avoidance of pain, we report over optimistically facts about where we are on the project, hoping that by the time we get to the next monthly report, I will have fixed whatever problems I've encountered to date. So people are looking for truth. People are looking for what truth is in their view. So we have an obligation. We have an obligation to tell the truth. Now, oftentimes, again, this is not consistent with every PMO, but oftentimes this reporting is done within the context of the PMO. PMOs have similar projects going on. PMOs have many opportunities to report progress and define problems and challenges and help get solutions. And so if it's done through the PMO process, then again, the governance over that process says that we have a requirement to deliver, quote, the truth. And that's what we have to do. If we don't, all we've done, and this is what I see happening in most project managers, unfortunately, is that all we really do is delay the truth. In other words, the more we delay the truth, the less possibility there is that I will be able to recover any problem or any challenging that I'm experiencing. So the sooner you can deliver the truth, the sooner we can define what needs to be done to correct the problem. And so the governance side says we are going to be able to control changes being made until we can define and clarify what those changes are. The whole idea of change management, which, as I said early on, is a very serious component of a PMO, is now taking front and center in the world of project management. There's actually a certification. It's called CCMP, the Certified Change Management Professional, who has become very sophisticated in the way that they manage change, expanding it beyond the traditional triple constraint of a project to where changes that potentially could impact other parts of the business are being controlled. Is a very major component. And oftentimes that component resides within the PMO organization. So we've got to look at it from that perspective. What is it we're trying to accomplish? If you're just trying to put together a plan and do the best you can, that's fine. But you've got to analyze the data. You've got to report the truth and make corrective actions wherever possible, which means getting approval or authorizations to make changes that may impact the rest of the business. Next slide, please. Now, because I've been in the business so long, going on 55 years, as a matter of fact, I've encountered all of these things multiple times, and I will admit they are not easy. And so when we look at this idea of governance, and if I can put it in the context of change control, one of the things we do in project management is that we define through the planning and analysis process, we define what's come to be known as a performance measurement baseline. And this becomes the baseline against which I will report progress or lack thereof. This is an area that when I talk about this to project managers, many of them do not know what a performance measurement baseline is. They don't understand that once I've created it and once I've said I agree that that represents how the work needs to be accomplished, that becomes under very strict change control. The governance says we will not make changes to a baseline without a clear scope change. So we may make alternate planning baselines, but the performance measurement baseline remains consistent until the scope of the project is changed. In other words, if I'm delivering the same scope 6 months from now that I said I was going to deliver when I created the performance measurement baseline, then the performance measurement baseline remains intact. Now, obviously, if I've decided I need to take a workaround, if I need to do something different in order to continue to get the scope of work done, then I will make an alternate planning baseline. But the baseline does not change for the scope of work that was originally signed on by the project manager. Well, that says that change control is an important piece. I have to categorize what level of changes, how often I will consider change, what constitutes a baseline change or a scope change. And all of those things have to be extremely well defined so that people who are using the project management process as a way to manage the organizational outputs understand what that is. They understand what the constraints are. They understand what the governance requires in terms of control over those baselines. So it's not as simple as planning the project and then going ahead and doing the project. And as things change the baseline until when you get to the end of the project. If you do that, it looks like you've got a perfect project. When in fact, you've gone through iteration after iteration after iteration based on a cost issue, based on a schedule issue, but certainly not based on a scope issue. Scope is sacred. And unless the customer, whether it's the PMO or whether it's someone outside the organization, unless the customer authorizes a scope change, you are not allowed to change the performance measurement baseline. Now, I hope that is clear, and I will say now that I've said it, and I hope that's clear, it's rarely done. What I've found is that changes are made fairly arbitrarily. And one of the main reasons changes are made is to make it look like we're on schedule or on cost. In other words, we change the baseline to eliminate variances. So if I've got a variance of plus $30,000, and that's going to throw me into a reporting scenario, well, I just revise the baseline and increase the baseline by 30,000, makes the variance go away, and everybody thinks we're doing really well. This is arbitrary baseline change, and the only time that really catches up to you is at the end of the project when the numbers don't add up. So we want to control that. We want to have the PMO as a mechanism to control the changes as part of the governance process. We have to be able to control what's done to the project planning, what's done to the project baseline in a variety of forms. The project manager has control of what gets submitted in terms of the change, request for change, if you will, and then it's analyzed from a PMO standpoint in terms of impact on the business, and changes are authorized accordingly. If they're not authorized, then we continue to work with the variance until we can identify a way to change the scope or to modify the plan by eliminating some scope and bringing us into balance with the rest of the triple constraint. Next slide, please. So this is kind of the idea behind projects, project planning, project execution. And what I want to say here is this is so much more than a lucky number. I mean, the chances of you having a project that finishes exactly when you think it will for exactly the amount of money and you deliver exactly what the customer wants, you have a higher probability of winning $1 billion lottery than you do in delivering that kind of a project. The point I want to make to you is this: project management does not guarantee success. Project management enables you to have a higher probability of success, but does not guarantee it. So if we look at that from the project management perspective, then clearly it adds value to everything we do. It makes it more important to implement project management in your organization. But in the same breath, I must tell you that it also implies there has to be some governance over the way project management is utilized in your organization. So when we form a PMO, part of the initial effort of the PMO is to establish the governance framework. How are we going to control? How are we going to analyze and authorize the viability of changes that are recommended as a result of implementing project management? And if this is not done, what you end up with is uncontrolled change, and which ultimately ends up, and I'll just use a simple term, a mess. And remember what we want to do by creating this baseline, by analyzing variances on the baseline and where reasonable, suggesting change. This creates the record of what it took to deliver that type of a project. Now, in the agile world, which is becoming more and more valid in terms of software projects for sure, they use the term retrospective. And what they mean by that is what we used to mean by learning curve, is that you execute the project based on the best known information you have at the time. And then as you go through time, you capture new truth that evolves as a result of the work you're doing, so that you can then incorporate that into the next project that you do that has similarities. These kinds of things are controlled by the PMO. They build up a learning curve treasure trove of project types and the kinds of things that are learned in the execution of those projects. We unfortunately do a not so good a job of this, and what I believe would be a continuous improvement process. We would get better and better and better at executing similar projects if we captured everything that took place in the execution of the project and looked at that from a relativity of another similar project to make sure that we incorporate the impacts of what took place on the project we've just completed. So this is the learning curve. This is controlled. We have to control it via the PMO or via some other function, although I think PMO is the right place. We have to control it to be sure that it represents what took place on the project that were executed within the confines of that PMO. So this is part of the process that we don't do very well. I mean, I've been doing this for over 5 decades, and I still see organizations doing things quite poorly, and then yelling about why the next project had the same problems. We all know what our friend Einstein says, that craziness is doing the same thing in the same way and expecting different results. So I think we have to understand that capturing the execution information for that project, that's going to allow us then to not repeat the mistakes that we may have made, and to repeat those things that we did that worked well.